Hello, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to the Early Career Roundtable conversation. I'm really excited to be here with these early career scholars and hear what they have to say. I also wanted to thank the organizers of the conference for doing such a great job organizing it and also helping with the tech and everything. It's very much appreciated. I wanted to start by introducing the first speaker, Naomi Rendina. I'll just introduce her a little bit and then she will talk, and then I'll introduce each person and then they will give their presentation. Naomi earned her PhD in history this summer from Case Western Reserve University. Her research interests focus on natural childbirth and pharmaceuticals, and she has an article forthcoming in Pharmacy and History. She currently holds 2 adjunct positions, is remote schooling a 6th grader, and is on the job market. And I will say I'm remote schooling a 7th grader, so I feel for you. Anyway, so we will hear from Naomi.
Thank you. Yes, remote schooling we're actually enjoying it, so I don't think I have a lot to add about it being terrible. But thank you for having me today. I earned my PhD this summer from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. But today I thought I would take some time to talk a little bit about my experiencing adjuncting, what the market's been like, and then some short comments about my dissertation. I've been an adjunct for the last 10 years. I currently hold 2 adjunct positions, one at Notre Dame College, which is a local Catholic school here in Cleveland, and then the other I recently started at California State University East Bay in the Health Sciences Department. I teach health humanities there. So I don't teach a full load. I only teach 2 classes a semester between the 2 institutions. So clearly this is not sustainable for life going forward, but I do still like the label early career researcher because I hope I still actually have a career ahead of me. I'm an optimist. So I've in total held 5 different adjunct positions over the last 10 years, ranging from online diploma mills to state universities. I've taught American history survey courses, women's studies, the first year experience course, and health humanities for the first time this semester. This spring, I actually get to teach a course on plagues, people, and population, which I'm really excited for the opportunity for. Like everyone else, I'm on the job market, both the academic market and the non-academic market. The academic market has been challenging on a good day, I think. Spring tends to be, I was on the market last year, ABD, and soft on the market the year before that. I've only really had any bites with postdocs and community colleges, so fingers crossed for this year. I'm geographically open, but even with the non-existent or with non-academic market, jobs are, I don't want to say they're non-existent, they're there. The non-academic jobs are there. They take creativity to look for. They take an extra level of networking to find and to get into, but they're there. But one of the biggest obstacles with non-academic jobs that I found so far is the fact that HR departments don't understand what historians can do and what our training allows us to do outside of reading books and writing history, as we have the writing skills, the synthesis, the analysis, critical thinking, writing, editing, all of these things that we can contribute to a variety of jobs, but they see PhD in history and they're scared of us. So maybe this is something we can talk about in the question time, is how early career researchers navigating the non-academic market can learn how to take these historical skills and apply them in a more appealing way. I'm not sure what else actually deserves to be included in my summary of my experiences in the academy so far. Again, I really just like to think I'm beginning and that this is just the beginning of a long career in academia, but I'm a hopeless optimist. And I know the realities of that is it may not be true, as I may not actually get to make it. But I do know I never get to miss an opportunity to highlight the fact that the history department here at Case, and particularly my advisor, Jonathan Sadowski, and my committee were unwaveringly supportive of me. They were encouraging, but they were also realistic. And there's nowhere that I could have gone for a more healthy graduate experience. So if there's anything I could tell graduate students or people looking to go to a PhD program, is invest the time in finding advisors and committees that are there for you and that are supportive and encouraging in realistic ways. And then that, of course, are good people. Got really lucky on that front. So my dissertation, which is now affectionately referred to as my book project, has a new working title, Inducing Nature, Pharmaceuticals in American Childbirth is what I'm working with. Part of the research was funded by AAHP's PhD thesis support grant in 2019. This project, that funding allowed me to go to Columbia to look at the Maternity Center Association's paper, and it was great. Part of this research, this research funded the Pitocin research at Cornell. Sorry, spent a lot of time in New York, and I get the places mixed up sometimes. In this project, I look at the role of pharmaceuticals in developing the meaning of natural childbirth in the post-war years. Specifically, I focus on labor-inducing drugs like ergot and oxytocin, which is what we now know as Pitocin, and how these drugs really muddy our understanding of natural childbirth. I framed my entire project with a story that my mom actually told me about her first birth experience in 1974. And to make a long story short, she'd always claimed that she'd had natural births. She didn't have the epidural, so that meant it was a natural childbirth. However, the further I got into my dissertation research and the more I had these conversations with her and the more I pushed her on these topics, she revealed that her OB had given her a dose of Pitocin. She claimed that it didn't work and she went home. She had some waffles and then labor started. And she said that the Pitocin didn't work. She went home and then she started labor, but it's hard to tell if it was the Pitocin that started labor or if it was her body that naturally started labor. Regardless, she was given Pitocin and she still claims that she had a natural childbirth, which doesn't match up to anything of what we believe of natural childbirth. So I became really fascinated in this idea of how could she claim that she had experienced a natural birth when she had been given drugs? And also, I couldn't find anything about this, and it was really frustrating. So my research centers pharmaceuticals in the historical narrative of childbirth in the United States. Although I focus on labor-inducing drugs, my analysis doesn't actually work without including pain medication. Obstetric pain medication already has an established literature, but it overlooks the relationship between pain medication and augmentation drugs. So what we tend to assume and what we believe is natural childbirth is rooted in the term that was meant as Lamaze popularized in the late 1970s, that when we hear Lamaze and when we hear natural, we think about a birth experience that's free of medication. And by medication, this almost always means pain medication. But that's not actually true. What about the induction drugs? And I asked myself this 100,000 times during research, is what about the induction drugs? So I looked at how advocates and women were using the term natural when describing their birth plans, and then also which drugs they were talking about. What I found was that women between 1946 and 1970 were sometimes using pain medication and then sometimes using induction drugs. But either which way, we're still calling their experiences natural. When the drug was given mattered to this definition. I noticed that women accepted the use of pain medication for the final pushes of labor, as well as accepted doses of Pitocin to help when she and or her uterus got tired. What seemed to matter the most was that she experienced labor. Literally, if she had experienced the first and second stages of labor, then it was considered a natural childbirth. If she did not feel the final pushes and delivery of the baby, but she felt everything else, that was still considered a natural childbirth. So from this, I could conclude that the only thing that mattered was that the woman was satisfied with the amount of pharmaceutical intervention in her experience, and that natural birth did not mean one thing. It varied from one woman to the next. And I realized these are the super cliff notes of the project. There's 5 chapters. There's a new way I'm going with new research, hopefully. but I only get a few minutes, so I'm going to share my contact information, and I would love to connect with anybody that's in the audience with questions or maybe to talk about this. Get your experiences if you gave birth in the 70s or in the 60s or your parents did. I would love to hear these stories and maybe even include them in the book. I don't know why I'm suddenly struggling to share this slide, but I will. It's coming. There you go. There it is. Ta-da! That's it. Can you...
Okay.
Did it work? Did it slide? Did it share?
Yes, I can see it.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yep.
That is fascinating research. Okay, so our second panelist is Jacob Green. Jacob is a PhD candidate in history at UCLA. He received a BA in history from the University of Chicago in 2009 and a master's degree in history from the University of British Columbia in 2018. Jacob's dissertation investigates the history of psychological research into the nature of mind-altering drugs such as nitrous oxide, caffeine, and cannabis between 1870 and 1933, with a focus on the United States. Jacob's work addresses questions related to why psychologists' efforts to provide definitive quantitative and qualitative descriptions of the effects of drugs ultimately failed, how psychological work on drugs intersected with psychologists' recreational use of intoxicants, and the cultural history of drugs and their use around the turn of the 20th century. Now I will turn to Jacob.
Hey everyone. First, I'd just like to say thanks to all the organizers for organizing this conference. I've already been to some really excellent panels, and I see that there are some more coming up pretty soon, so I'm excited about that. So just to give you an idea of the state of my project, I had my prospectus defense about a week and a half ago, so this is still a very new project, and I'm trying to figure out how everything's going to sort of fit together. So I'd welcome comments in that direction for sure. As the introducer said, basically my dissertation is on the history of psychological research into mind-altering drugs between about 1870 and 1933. And I was initially sort of inspired to look at this by the current wave of resurgence of psychedelic research that's happening right now, where people are looking at mind-altering drugs and using them to investigate the brain. Other people at this conference have sort of talked about medicinal investigations into mind-altering drugs I've seen. So there certainly is work on that before the 1960s. But I think a lot of people sort of associate the rise of science and mind-altering drugs with the 50s and 60s, either with sort of the revelation in pharmacology with new drugs like Miltown and Thorazine, or with LSD research and things like that. But one of my goals is to show that sort of like pure science research, by which I mean research about the nature of the brain, using drugs actually dates back about 100 years before that, starting around the time that psychology began as a discipline. So my dissertation has two sections, I would say, although I'm sort of still figuring this out. The first is on self-experimentation and the role it played in drug experimentation during this period. So for the first, 30 or 40 years of psychology's history, from about late 1870s to, early 20th century, it was very common for psychologists to serve as both experimenters and experimental subjects. So often you'd have two psychology students, maybe. One would sort of be the experimental subject, and the other person would be an experimenter, and they'd sort of switch off like this. So experimenters sort of using their bodies as sites of experimentation was something that was very common in psychology and is very well covered in the literature. I'm going to look at self-experimentation in sort of a broader sense, which also includes sort of in the sense of like recreational experimentation with drugs. Because many of the psychologists that I'm investigating, such as James McKeen Cattell, who's probably best known as the founder of Science and the Psychological Review, they use drugs recreationally in addition to scientifically. So, for example, I have these scientific notebooks where James McKeen Cattell is making very careful introspective observations about the psychological effects that drugs have, and also noting changes to things like his blood pressure and how they affect his ability to perform physical feats such as running. But at the same time, he's making notes about how he's taking large doses of cannabis and then going to the opera with the hope that he's going to have a nice music experience. So there's an intersection between people using drugs for fun and science, and the line between those things is not very clear. Another sort of area where self-experimentation is involved with things outside the laboratory is psychologists sort of coming up with metaphysical ideas about sort of their personal philosophy on religion and the nature of reality. So, for example, William James inhaled nitrous oxide in the 1880s. And while he was high on nitrous, he sort of had an experience where everything was united into one gigantic whole. He felt the universe was all one giant entity, and everything's interconnected. And when he came down from this experience, he no longer really felt the force of this revelation, but he came to believe that Hegelian philosophy was based in a similar emotion. So basically what James was saying is the reason that Hegel doesn't make any sense is because Hegel was essentially high all the time. And if you want to really understand Hegelianism, just inhale some nitrous oxide, and that's going to really give you some insight into the dialectic. There are other figures who sort of link Hegelianism to nitrous oxide intoxication in psychological work. Another figure, Edmund Delabar, linked it to cannabis. Delabar experimented with cannabis for about 30 years, but never published his research. In addition to sort of like tests of physical strength and things that cannabis affects, Delabar also wrote about how inhaling cannabis made him think differently about the problem of Buddha and other things. So this sort of intersection between self-experimentation, pleasure, and religion, as well as science, is the first section of the dissertation. The second section, which I'm still thinking about how to link to the first, is related to evaluating drugs and determining which drugs are legal and which drugs aren't. As many people have mentioned at this conference and is generally talked about quite a lot, race is often a factor in why some drugs are criminalized and others aren't. So, for example, in the lead up to the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, marijuana became heavily associated with Mexican immigrants, and that's part of the reason why there was sort of a scare about marijuana. In this section, I'm going to argue that something sort of in addition to race is perhaps a factor that we should consider, and class, which people have talked about as well, which is the ability of drugs to enable people or prevent them from sort of participating in the modern capitalist order. So, for example, Clark Hull, a psychologist, was hired by this group called the Committee to Study the Tobacco Problem to investigate whether or not smoking tobacco made people more efficient workers or better able to perform intellectual tasks. And this Committee to Study the Tobacco Problem had a bunch of famous people on it, including people like Henry Ford and William Osler. And this is right around the time of alcohol prohibition. And so there was a move to ban tobacco and actually peyote as well around this time. And so part of this effort was hiring a psychologist to sort of show, hey, these drugs aren't making good workers, so maybe we should ban tobacco. I'm also thinking of maybe having a section in Germany about Emil Kraepelin and the history of psychomimetic drugs, but I'm sort of nervous about expanding beyond the national context that I'm doing right now. And sort of an overall theme, which I haven't mentioned too, this is going to spread through everything, is data and data practices. The mindset that people have when they take mind-altering drugs, as well as the setting they're in, really affects the subjective experience that people have while they're taking drugs. So it's very challenging to sort of pin down a definitive qualitative or quantitative description of what a drug is. So I'm going to be looking at how psychologists use various instruments and methods such as introspection to sort of try to nail down this experience and investigate why they pretty much ultimately failed at this. A lot of the results are inconclusive, and the Delabar, who I mentioned, worked on cannabis for 30 years but never published his results, at least preliminarily, I believe, largely because of issues around data and data practices. So I'd welcome any questions or suggestions about my dissertation. As I said, it's still in a pretty early state. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. These are wonderful research topics. So I want to turn to our third panelist, Barbara DiGennaro. I think I said that right. Okay, Barbara is a PhD candidate in the History Department and in the History of Science and Medicine program at Yale University. She holds a degree in Early Modern History from the University of Bologna. Her dissertation focuses on the culture of drugs or science, medicine, regulation, and the market in early modern Italy, and it is tentatively titled The State Drug, The Politics of Teriac in Early Modern Italy. She was awarded the Jerry Standard Memorial Award for an article on apothecaries that she wrote in 2015, and she currently has 2 articles under review. So I will turn it over to Barbara.
So thank you, Paula, for your introduction, and I'm especially glad today to be able to thank publicly the American Institute for the History of Pharmacy for its generous support to my dissertation. Lucas for inviting me today, and Kristen and Greg for the organization. So I'm going to try to share and I also like to say that I'm talking from Bologna, Italy, and it's almost 10 in the evening. So I'm going to try and share my presentation. So I'm going to tell you the story of my dissertation. So my research follows the social life of this drug called Theriac, which was made of 64 ingredients, including opium, viper's flesh, and materia medica from the Middle East, Asia, Africa. And it was used to cure all sorts of ailments, from toothache to plague. And this drug lasted for almost 18 centuries. So it is this pervasiveness and this longue durée that made me interested and triggered my intellectual curiosity. I wanted to explain, to understand what this longevity tells us about the society in which this drug maintained such a privileged status. And when I started methodologically, I was building on the work of anthropologists studying the social lives of commodities, and then medical anthropologists applied this method to the study of pharmaceuticals as social phenomena. But today, I'm very happy to say that I can start conversations with Benjamin Brin and the Age of Intoxication, Hebbian and the Pharmaceutical Object in China, Emma Sperry, who's studying the exotica, the materia medica coming from other continents, Justin Rivers working on patented remedies, Sabrina Minuzzi working on secrets, and Paula De Vos, our own Paula De Vos, working on compound remedies. So this is really an exciting time to study drugs in the early modern period. So drugs are inherently transformative. They have the power to destabilize and change, but and this is really my overarching argument. Theriac was actually used to stabilize and preserve, and not just the health of individuals, but Theriac was used to preserve and strengthen the health, so to speak, of specific groups within a society. And these were and this was the traditional hierarchy. So the dissertation examines relationships among and between physicians, apothecaries, rulers, and consumers of drugs. And my primary sources are archival documents from health services, health offices, medical colleges, apothecary guilds, medical tribunals. I also compiled a list of texts containing the word Theriac in the title, and I am up to 500 right now between 1497 and 1800. And also to expand the analysis to culture and society at large, I examined private letters, non-medical literature such as travel guides, poetry, political treatises, and pictorial and material evidence. So following the Theriac throughout 3 centuries, I change actors. So I go to the actors that Theriac brings me to. And the story I think is fascinating and is that of a drug that during the Middle Ages lost prestige because it was impossible to find the ingredients. Knowledge of these ingredients was considered lost. But then in the 16th century, Theriac became an object of study, experimentation and research at court and among collectors, physicians, and learned apothecaries. In search for an answer against plague epidemics and as a consequence of the botanical renaissance, research on Theriac was an innovative endeavor, and even champions of the scientific revolution like Vesalius saw this research with favor. One of the interesting parts during the Renaissance of the history of Theriac is that productions became public ceremonies held in public. And I argue, and this is a well-known fact, but what I argue is that these were health rituals that were not only related to a new interest for science, but that brought prestige to those who performed it, and that were a sort of public promise for a remedy against the plague for the commoners. So alongside restrictive measures such as quarantine and cordons sanitaires, Theriac productions figured as a positive ritual for collecting healing, and it's very difficult not to make a parallel with what is happening today. The hope for a medicine that works attracts interest. So the effort of rulers, learned physicians, and apothecaries became visible. And for as much as this rebirth took place in court in the 17th century, also the market caught up. And so the market of Theriac grew very much. And so now the actors change in the 17th century. We have now apothecary entrepreneurs and patients. Pharmacy, and especially Galenic pharmacy, was undergoing great changes because of the new intercontinental routes, because of the chemical drugs. But the formula apothecaries found with Theriac, made of ceremonies, pins, pamphlets, and supported by the validation of the medical colleges, resisted all competition. These ceremonies were really the opening of the black box. So in the second part of the century, Jesuits brought Theriac everywhere, at the court of the Chinese emperor, in the missions of Brazil, and then in the 18th century, resisting the voices of physicians that were more and more critical of what they came to consider a monstrous composition or a hellish brew. Theriac took over the world. So we find it in ships across the Atlantic, and then the Ottomans started to buy Venetian called treacle at the time, and Venetian production grew so much that vipers used to compound the remedy went extinct in the nearby hills of Venice. So pharmacy in the 18th century already had an environmental impact. And and I'm going to close now. The relationship between government and the social hierarchy and Theriac lasted until the French Revolution, which destroyed guilds and all the ancients, the Ancien Régime fell. And but at the same time, when the Austrian governor of Venice in 1801 decided to print a new pharmacopoeia, he said that he wrote that the old medicines should be so the pharmacopoeia should be renovated, but that and I quote, certain medicaments protected by the faith of the plebs should not be excluded from use, not to grieve men of good faith. In other words, governments have always been a little bit, were still paternalistic toward their subjects, and kept Theriac, which was sold until the beginning of this century. And I am going to try and stop it here.
But, oh, sorry, was that the end of it then? Or what
Yeah.
you were saying? Okay, okay, good. I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. And I should say, Theriac was in Mexican colonial pharmacies and prescriptions too, so it was all over the world. So I want to go ahead and introduce our fourth speaker, Aileen Teague. Aileen is an assistant professor of international affairs at Texas A&M's Bush School of Government and Public Service. She previously held a postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Teague earned her PhD in history from Vanderbilt University in 2018 and served in the Marine Corps, the U.S. Marine Corps from 2006 to 2014. Her work has been published in academic journals, including Diplomatic History and the Social History of Alcohol and Drugs. She is currently drafting a book manuscript which examines the effects of United States drug policies and policing efforts on the 1970s and 1980s Mexican politics and society.
Hi, good afternoon. It's great to be here. And when Lucas Richard reached out about the panel and just this whole topic of early career faculty, I was immediately interested, just because this idea of being an early career faculty, like Naomi, I also think it's a really interesting label that I'm proud to identify with. I do want to speak a little bit about my research and how it kind of it relates to the history of pharmacy community, but I think that what I wanted to talk most about was just the experience of being early career faculty. I just started my first job about a month ago, and it felt like it took a long time to get here, with grad school, with a postdoctoral fellowship, with a number of years of the uncertainty of the job market. And when I was going through, I was a diplomatic historian that also studied the social history of drugs, and that's where my research gravitated toward. And so I focused my research in Latin America, particularly Mexico. And so going through, and I'm happy to talk specifically about my research, but I think what I want to stress more is just this notion of what it feels like to be an early career person, trying to situate yourself within a field when there's a lot of uncertainty in the future, which is something I definitely struggled with. And I think I came in, I was in the Marines for a number of years after undergrad, and I was, very new to academia. And I think that what really helped me going through was navigating this sort of uncertain environment was to come in and immediately cast a wide net. I'm in international affairs and I teach classes on drug policy more broadly, but here I am in the community that's very different from people who I see with on a day-to-day basis at work or through my research. And I think that it's important when you're going through, especially for people who are grad students, to cast a wide net in terms of the types of people that you interact with, because you don't know where those kinds of connections are going to lead you and what kinds of insights you're going to get. And for me, it was the case that it was a complete accident that I started working in Mexico, but it was just these connections that led me there and ultimately put me on a path that led me to where I am today. And I think that especially with studying the history of pharmacy, with drugs, with pharmaceuticals in general, there's a lot of public interest in these topics. And so while on the one note, as academics, we tend to focus very sharply on one aspect of a specific topic, there's so much public interest in the opioid epidemic and the ways in which psychoactive substances are affecting our societies. And so I think that we can reach the public not only through our teaching and our research, but through public engagement, through the writing of op-eds, which is something I've gotten to do, which has introduced me to new and different intellectual communities and opportunities for public engagement. And so I don't want to harp, too much on the job market, but that tends to be navigating that and the uncertainties and how people experience the uncertainties of navigating as an early career faculty member. I think that it's important to touch on those because, a lot of times we find that we're sort of boxed up in a specific area. And then when COVID hits or when there's certain uncertainties with opportunities, we wonder how far it is that we're going to be able to go, in our careers. I think going through as a junior faculty member as well, it's important, or even just going through the job market, it's important to also cast your net wide with respect to who your mentors are. I was lucky to have a very great graduate advisor, but I think that mentors can come in all different shapes and forms, and you don't only have to have one of them. And I think that these are the kinds of experiences down the road that help you to foster new kinds of connections. When I was at the later stages of my PhD, I reached out to a number of junior faculty members, because when you're going through the market and trying to secure a job, I mean, these are the people who had just been through the process. So it's important, and a lot of times they're complete, sharks when looking at your CVs and your job market materials, and it might not be very pleasant to hear their feedback, but that criticism is necessary, I believe, in order to make it to the next stage, and to become a junior faculty member, in a university, or to get yourself connected with the non-academic job market, and especially with a topic like drugs and pharmaceuticals, there's a lot of opportunities for engagement outside of the academy in places like think tanks, foundations, and that sort of thing. Finally, I just want to spend a couple of minutes reflecting on where I am right now as a junior faculty member who just started a job, and what's sort of going through my mind now that everything has sort of settled down, which of course is, I spend a lot of time teaching and prepping my courses, and that takes quite a bit of time when you're just starting out at the beginning. And it's been really great to reach out to my colleagues and kind of get their advice on those sorts of things. But also, I mean, a number of us have spent a lot of time talking about our research in our book. And I mean, this is the stage where we've been writing these dissertations for a number of years. And now we are, now that the tenure track kind of actually begun. So there's the actual pressure of writing and getting that done and getting that book prepped for not just speaking to people in our field, but also, if we can, to a broader audience, so that we can connect with other types of communities. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about as I'm kind of setting my goals here for the next year and 3 years and 5 years going ahead, as well as something that enters the conversation at times, but isn't always at the forefront, is this notion of the competing demands of being a successful graduate student, postdoc, or junior professor, and then maintaining the balance between what you're supposed to do to be successful professionally, but then also achieving a good state of personal balance. So I didn't really talk too much about my research about drug policy in Mexico, which is very important to me. But I thought that in the spirit of what it means to be an early career faculty, member with this panel, I wanted to just share with you some of the predominant thoughts that came up more on a personal level, and then also what I've learned and what I'm thinking about with goal setting in the future. So thank you so much, and I look forward to any questions or about Mexico and drugs, or about the experience of being a junior faculty member.
Well, thank you. This is, I think, really rich and varied panel. They're right on time, which is great. So what I was going to do was read questions from the chat. So if you have questions, go ahead and put them there. And we've actually already had a series of questions and comments. It wasn't, I'll definitely read the questions, and I think everyone can see the comments. So maybe I'll just not, to skip through those, but I'll read the questions. And the first one was for Naomi. It says, from Michael Oldani. And I should say too, I apologize, it's kind of small print for me to see. So anyway, it says, was the question about the definition of natural childbirth, and what pharmaceuticals negate a natural childbirth? Oh, I think that you're muted still.
Yeah, I'm muted.
I know.
Sorry, it was like, oh, I'm muted. I saw the question, and I thought about it, and it's a question that I think keeps evolving the more that I write and the more I work on this project. The project started out looking at natural childbirth and the way that women were sold this idea, and I saw a lot on Lamaze, and our connotations of natural childbirth automatically bring us back to the ideals that Lamaze taught us in the mid and late 1970s. But the more I read on it, the more I realized that when we said pain-free, or when we said no drugs, it meant pain medication. And I realized, well, what about induction drugs? And so it's, what does this meaning of natural mean? What does it mean to have natural childbirth? But how do these other drugs play into that meaning? So I don't think it's necessarily when or what drugs negate natural childbirth. It's more of a when and which drugs change the meaning. It's how does it play with the word? What does natural even mean on this? So in the dissertation, I actually talk about there being two different categories of drugs. There's the pain medication and then the augmentation drugs. And it's how the drugs interact with the body that I think was an important characteristic. Pain medications stop things that are expected in the body, and augmentation drugs help physiological processes do what they're supposed to do. So it looks as though the drugs that negate what were considered unnatural, and drugs that help what was physiologically expected of the body, like uterine contractions, those weren't considered when talking about medication free because they help the body do what it was expected to do. If that makes sense. Is that enough? Happy to talk about it more later in an email or anything. Happy to.
Yeah, I think that's great. Okay, and I was going to say, if I read out a question, then you have a follow-up. Feel free to unmute and ask a follow-up too. I think that's okay. I think we have time to. So, okay. So I think this one was for Jacob. This question, it says, does the term category recreational really fit experiences like those of James McKean? I'm sorry, Cattell. Anyway, or Joel Elks or other neuropsychopharmacologists engaged in self-experimentation? What would you argue to keep that term anachronistic as it may be, or discard it in favor of another term or category of activity?
Well, I would like to hear if you guys think that recreational is a really loaded term. And I'm not really familiar with Joel Elks. I could see how other neuropharmacologists might not be doing recreational things exactly, like W.B. Halsted, for example, got addicted to cocaine and initially through experiments, and then through addiction, he kept using it outside the laboratory. But the people that I'm looking at really did use drugs recreationally. Like Cattell initially came to drugs because his friend introduced him to drugs, and is basically just like, let's have some fun and get high together. And that sort of changed into science after that. And that's a kind of the experience of a lot of people that I'm seeing here. So I think recreation is an appropriate term. Yes.
No, it's interesting. It makes me think about too, because the term drugs, like drugs is recreational drugs or drugs is medicinal drugs, and when does that sort of that separation take place? I'm interested in that. Anyway, okay, and that was from Nancy Campbell, I should say, that question. Let's see. Next, I'll just read this fun fact about Hegel. Out of all his correspondences that have been preserved, the largest collection consists of communications with his wine dealers. I like that. Anyway, okay, so let's see. These are more comments. I'm wondering, let me just skip down and see if we have any questions coming in. Okay, question for Barbara. Can you give details on how the vipers were part of the crafting process? What were the discussions like when they ran out of snakes? Any interesting ideas circulating?
Yeah, so there was a lot of discussion about the vipers, and one of the interesting part, I think, is that these vipers had to be validated, certified by physicians in the place where they were collected. And so when they ran out of vipers, they started a conversation about what mountains should they now go look for vipers. And so they looked toward the Alps, and so after that, but I think that the question of the vipers is very interesting for its symbolic value, because this idea that inside the antidote is a part of the poison, which, if you think it's about it, it's very similar to the idea of vaccination, that you have something that is the evil within the medicine that you're taking, which is very representative of drugs in general, because we know that they, depending on their dose, they might be beneficial or not. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. That was, and I should say that was from Richard Del Rio, that question. Then from Greg Bond, we have a question for Aileen. I completely agree in the importance of public engagement by historians through op-eds and other outreach efforts, but have departments or universities begun to recognize this valuable labor as part of writing or service for academics? A good question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question, Greg. The truth is, I mean, it depends on the department. Mine does. I mean, it doesn't recognize it in the sense of like a research in just the sense of like research in an academic journal or such. But it also depends on what you want your impact to be in the long run. And so I think that for me, I think it's important to, especially as an early faculty member and trying to create opportunities for myself and trying to, I guess, provide advice of what it might be like for others. I think casting the net wide is important. And if you can manage doing public engagement and reaching different types of audiences, I don't see how ultimately one loses from doing that. I mean, some departments absolutely, especially in the humanities, might not recognize, op-eds or these kinds of endeavors as equally as 100% academic endeavors. But I think that for the overall impact, I think it can help to further your research down the road, especially for people who are facing an uncertain path in academia. It's a suggestion for opening up different avenues.
Can I just chime in on that for a second? As contingent faculty, this is also going to be from department to department, it might be differently, but not all historians in academia are going to be able to do these things like op-eds and whatnot if they don't have some sort of security. Contingent faculty don't have the extra time to do the op-eds and do the public outreach that we want to be doing. I'm not saying this like you're saying something wrong. You're absolutely right. Historians need to be reaching out like this, but we can't forget the massive amount of historians that are contingent and the knowledge that we're missing because we're not paying people to do this work and we're not paying our contingent labor enough to have the time. Our contingent labor force is too busy with teaching at multiple institutions, multiple preps, and having side hustles to make ends meet that we don't have the time to be doing this kind of outreach as much as we want to.
I don't disagree with you, but I think that, and I think it's really interesting, and I think that maybe Paula hit the nail on the head on this, like the types of interpretations that we all brought to what might an early faculty panel, you know what I mean, what that actually means when you're actually talking about that without much, with just very little guidance. And, I think that one thing that I struggled with myself is especially going through the job market and, and I speak to contingency faculty and I speak to others, is that we can just all kind of get into a bubble in which we're sort of powerless, we don't have time. And my only efforts were just to provide suggestions of things that people can do to cast their net wider, as opposed to sort of lamenting, what we can't do. And obviously, we can't all do everything across the board, but I'm never going to stop providing different kinds of suggestions where one might be able to engage their research in different communities to perhaps create opportunities for themselves down the road.
Absolutely. I think giving more ideas and networking and talking to people, I think this is one of those ways that Twitter is really helpful, is making those connections with people that you might not have been able to make connections with before. These online conferences like this, maybe we'll make some sort of connection with somebody we've never worked with before, that, co-writing, somebody just made a comment about having an in at newspapers and where are we looking. Maybe you have a recommendation on where some of the graduate students can try to do an op-ed where, like I don't think ideas are bad. I think ideas are really, really good. And I have one for you. I actually have an email drafted already for you.
Okay. Well, I mean, obviously, like it's interesting, clearly, that people get riled up by this subject of public engagement on a scope all the way down the road. I mean, I taught a class on the opioid epidemic when I was at Brown, and we got to get students out into the community. It was incredibly time consuming. But again, these are kinds of things that create opportunities. And sometimes when we're going through this job market that's a bit stubborn, you just have to kind of think outside the box. And yes, I know that we only have a limited amount of time, during the day, but I think that in some cases, depending on what your circumstances are, I mean, you kind of have to set yourself apart and think differently to get those kinds of opportunities, especially at times when there are not a lot of those out there.
Yeah, I've just been thinking of you all, on the job market, finishing dissertations, starting new jobs in this kind of environment that it's difficult enough for me when I've been at my university for, almost 20 years. And I feel like it feels like the first year of teaching again, having to learn all of this new technology and then be running discussions in this totally different way. Now participating in conferences in this different kind of way, and to have to be taking all that on when you're just starting out. I was wondering I don't know if you want to share what the personal experience of that is like, if how you manage that and sort of navigate all of this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very weird time to be starting my career. I mean, after 9 years of training, it's a very strange time. I think you just kind of have to take it, I'm teaching 2 classes, and, I'm doing the best I can on the side to meet different faculty members one by one, either Zoom or a socially distanced coffee, so that people know me in the department, so I try to pick a different person every week. I try to stay on a schedule. I mean, I have a military background, which sometimes in academia is a bit like questionable, but like I operate on a pretty structured schedule to get my writing in, to get my teaching in, to get my family time in. And that's what I'm just trying to stick to, especially in these uncertain times that we're all experiencing in very different ways. And then trying to make sure at the end of the day, also realizing that students that I'm working with as well are also facing these uncertain times, so that when I kind of want to get looking too internal and in my mentality, making sure to remind myself that I'm also there to support their progress through the classes I'm teaching them.
Yeah. Yeah, no.
And I also just wanted to there was a question I think that came up about op-eds, because we were talking about that before, and it's as someone who is, I mean, I've sent op-eds, I've from my local newspaper to I got through connections, I got something published in the Washington Post last year. I mean, it's whether you're super developed or you're, a grad student, you can just, it's actually great. And it's also a way to kind of mix up our writing styles to actually learn how to communicate one argument very simply in a way in which people outside of our own intellectual communities will understand that. And I think that down the road, that's only made me a better scholar in the history publications that I've published as well. And so I mean, there's blogs that I've published in. There are, and this is not something that I'm going to budget 5 or 10 days for or anything like that. I mean, sometimes it can be very refreshing to finish a piece of writing very quickly and take some of that energy to transfer it to some of those lengthier scholarly articles.
Yeah. I can go through and read well, let me just ask, are there any more questions? Because I could go through and read the comments. I'm not sure if what the protocol is on this, but okay, here's a question for the panel generally. When would you think a person is wasting their time in the scholarly context? Interesting. Anybody want to take that on?
So I didn't. I just met somebody who told me that if you're 3 years and nothing has happened, you should leave. But this was for the Italian market, and I wasn't. I was not commenting on Aileen and Naomi because I came back to Italy because of the pandemic, and here the work situation. It's I know this is hard to believe, but it's even worse. And so, it's like I don't know. You just do as much as you can, thinking out of the box for as long as you can, and then whatever avenues comes to you. This is not something that we can fix. This is my sense that this is we are at the bottom of the ladder, so it's not up to us to fix this. This is something that university administrators, tenured faculty, they have to work for us. They have to, spend some of their time asking that the university hire more faculty, take less adjuncts. This is not, we can write op-eds, we can think out of the box, we can continue our research, but this is not something we can just save ourselves if we're lucky. It's if the academia as a whole wants to save this system of sharing and creating knowledge, it's something that people that have more power than us can and time hopefully has to do.
I think it becomes a waste of time when you can no longer support or maintain or work towards the life that you wanted. There's no point in writing op-eds and articles and doing all these things if you're not if you can't sustain life. So I think that might be a year on the market for some, that might be 2 for others, it might be more for others, but there becomes a point, and it's not a definitive point, where my point is that it becomes a waste of time. Then it might be somebody else's. It might not be my waste of time at the same point that it's somebody else's. So it's going to vary from one person to the next. But I know I can't sustain being on the job market forever. I still have a kid to raise, and I have a life to provide for her. I can't sit around and do class by class contracts and raise a kid at the same time forever. This isn't fair to me, and this isn't fair to her. So at some point, I don't want to call it giving up, but I can move past it and I can do something else that's just as fulfilling, or if not more fulfilling. So never know. It looks like there's more questions coming in.
Yeah, I was going to say, so Greg Bond says, building on Richard's question a little bit, in the current atmosphere of increasing contingency, would you still encourage students to go to grad school? That's a great question too. Yeah.
Who wants to take that one?
I know, I was just thinking, wait, I guess that that would be for the, people who are, I would say mainly people who are advising PhD students. Like I advise, we have a master's program at my university, and anyone who's interested in a PhD, we are very careful about those we encourage. And in that sense, I'll say there's a whole host of things they need to do, publish articles, present at conferences, do absolutely stellar work to be considered for a PhD program. And in that sense, I think my colleagues and I are always very, very careful to let them know that, of the pitfalls of it, and the time it's going to take, and that there is no guarantee of a permanent position at the end. And then even if there is a permanent position, the tenure process is very, is a very trying thing to go through as well. And so we're very careful about that. But as far as the master's degree goes, like they can teach community college from that. Like there's some very practical outcomes that can come from a master's. And there's not it's not the same time commitment and financial commitment I mean, on the other hand, if PhDs are doing more, full support more now. So yeah, I mean, I think I've always been really, really hesitant, really careful and hesitant about that. But I'd be curious to hear from people that advise PhD students what they're seeing too. If anybody wants to weigh in.
I would just say don't go into debt for it. It's not worth it.
And I'll also say my university system has put a freeze on hiring. It's the Cal State system, which is a huge public university system in California. And, they hiring freeze, except the top administration. And they just hired a new chancellor with a 30% raise, making $600,000 a year. And, so I'm so frustrated at those structural issues. This is a whole another thing, but I find that it's this top-heavy administration, and then the support isn't there for the faculty, and certainly not for the students. And I think that Barbara's absolutely right that this isn't your issue to solve. And I think we need to change. Something needs to change in the academy too. Anyway, yeah, yeah, good stuff. Yeah, they're good at cutting the budget. Yeah. So anyway, let's see. How would you like to form, this is from Bettina Warig. How would you like to form an early career persons union? A great idea. Yeah. Well, I wanted to see, does anybody have anything more to add? I think we're out of time, but we can certainly stay for a couple more minutes if anybody had more things to add or anything like that. Nope. Okay. I think we're good, but I think I speak for others at this conference. If there's anything that I could do to help, or any of us, I think we need a lot of mentoring. A lot of mentoring is something that we can do, and helping to connect people and that kind of thing, and help with publication networking and that kind of thing, edited volumes and stuff, and putting people in touch with editors and things like that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah.